I used to work at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of our town, a place that had seen better days long before the hurricane swept through. The storm left our community in ruins, forcing many businesses to shutter for good, but the diner stayed open. With nowhere else for locals to gather, it became a strange mix of refuge and desolation. I worked the night shift, 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. The pay was mediocre, but I liked the solitude of those hours. The place was usually empty after 11, with only the occasional trucker or wanderer stopping by for coffee and pie. The diner had this old, retro charm: red vinyl booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years, and a faded neon sign that buzzed faintly in the dark. It was just me and the cook, Frank, most nights. Frank was a burly, no-nonsense guy in his 50s who kept to himself. He didn't talk much, which suited me fine. I spent most of my shift at the counter, sipping lukewarm coffee and flipping through old magazines while keeping an eye on the front door. One night around midnight, I heard the bell over the door jingle. A man walked in, a tall figure wearing a faded black hoodie and jeans. His face was partially shadowed by the hood, but what I could see was unsettling. His eyes were sunken, his expression eerily blank. He didn't say anything, just slid into one of the booths near the back and sat there staring at the table. "Coffee?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly. I poured a cup and brought it over, setting it in front of him. He didn't thank me or even look up. Just wrapped his hands around the cup and stared into it. Something about him put me on edge, but I chalked it up to paranoia. We'd had plenty of odd customers before. An hour passed and the man hadn't moved. His coffee sat untouched, and he didn't order anything else. Frank popped his head out from the kitchen at one point, giving me a questioning look. I shrugged, mouthing, "I don't know." Finally, I decided to approach him. "Hey, is everything all right?" He looked up slowly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes didn't seem to focus on me. Instead, they looked past me like he was staring at something, or someone, just over my shoulder. "Do you know what it feels like to be watched?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "They're always watching," he murmured, his gaze dropping back to the table. Then, as if a switch flipped, he slid out of the booth and walked out the door without another word. The bell jingled and he was gone. Frank came out from the kitchen. "What the hell was that about?" I shook my head. No idea. Guy was weird. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, and by the time my shift ended, I'd almost forgotten about him. Almost. When I stepped outside to head home, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking. The diner was a 15-minute walk from my apartment, down a quiet stretch of road lined with dense trees on either side. The only light came from the occasional street lamp, casting long, flickering shadows across the pavement. About halfway home, I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees. I stopped and looked around, but the road was empty. I told myself it was just the wind and kept walking. Then I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, matching my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the dark, empty road stretching out behind me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I quickened my pace, the footsteps growing louder and faster behind me. Panic surged through me as I broke into a run. I didn't dare look back. When I reached my apartment building, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. I slammed it shut behind me and bolted it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I peeked out the window, my eyes scanning the street below. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. That night, I barely slept. The next day at work, I told Frank what had happened. He shrugged it off, muttering something about crazy people being everywhere these days. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, the bell over the door jingled again. My heart sank as I saw him, the man from the night before. He sat in the same booth, in the same position, staring at the table. This time I didn't approach him. I stayed behind the counter, my eyes darting between him and the clock. At exactly 2 a.m., he stood up and walked out without a word. When my shift ended, I asked Frank to walk me home. I didn't tell him why, and he didn't ask. I never saw the man again after that night, but I always felt like he was there, somewhere in the shadows, watching. I quit the diner a week later. Sometimes, when I walk home late at night, I still hear footsteps behind me. And even though I know it's probably nothing, I can't bring myself to turn around. I used to work as a night security guard at a research lab in the industrial part of town. The place didn't look like much from the outside, just a plain gray building with no signage and a modest parking lot. I never fully understood what they did there. My job was simple: monitor the cameras, patrol the halls once or twice a night, and make sure everything stayed secure. The shift was quiet most nights, which suited me just fine. I worked alone, arriving at 9 p.m., turning on the security systems and then settling into the small monitoring room. It wasn't much, just a desk with a couple of monitors displaying low-resolution feeds from the building's cameras. Around 1 a.m. that night, I heard a faint noise. It was subtle, like the soft click of a latch, but it was enough to pull my attention away from the screens. I stepped into the hallway, letting the silence wrap around me as I scanned for anything unusual. There were only 3 doors in the hallway, 2 leading to lab spaces and 1 to a storage room. All of them were closed. I checked each one, peering briefly inside, but everything seemed normal. The labs were empty, filled with rows of desks and lab benches cluttered with equipment I couldn't identify. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe the sound came from outside, or maybe my ears were playing tricks on me. I returned to the monitoring room, leaving the door open to hear more clearly if it happened again. The cameras showed nothing unusual. The building's exterior was quiet, with no movement near any of the entrances. About 20 minutes later, I was beginning to relax again when I heard it. A faint, deliberate creak like a door slowly opening. I froze. Heart pounding, I stepped into the hallway. One of the lab doors was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed that door earlier. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door cautiously, nudging it open with my foot. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of a computer monitor in the far corner. I stepped inside, scanning the rows of desks and equipment. At first, I saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught the slightest movement, a shadow shifting against the wall. I turned my head and locked eyes with someone crouched beneath a desk. It was a man, unkempt and gaunt, with disheveled black hair and eyes that seemed both wild and desperate. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he started to move, rising slowly but deliberately as if deciding whether to run or lunge at me. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted, sprinting down the hallway and out the front door. The motion triggered the security alarm, and I kept running until I was a safe distance from the building. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and called the police. It took the officers only a few minutes to arrive. Together, we reviewed the security footage from the entire night, but there was no sign of the man entering the building. He hadn't come through the front door, the back door, or any of the windows. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. When we searched the lab, there was no sign of him. Nothing was missing and nothing seemed disturbed apart from the door I'd found open. The company didn't offer much explanation. They insisted they had no idea who the man could have been or why he'd been there. But something about their response didn't sit right with me. They'd gone out of their way to hire a security guard for this tiny operation, and now I was starting to wonder why. Was it possible they knew someone might try to get in? Someone with a personal grudge? Or someone looking for something specific? I stayed at that job for a few more months, but I never felt safe after that night. The memory of those dark, unblinking eyes still haunts me. Whatever that man was doing in the lab, I was just glad I didn't stick around to find out. I was 17 when this happened. working a part-time gig delivering groceries for a small, family-owned shop in my town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid decently, and I didn't mind the late hours. My shift started at 5 p.m. and usually wrapped up around midnight. This particular night was uneventful at first. I handled my usual deliveries, chatted with regulars, and kept an eye on the time. Around 10:30, just when I thought the night was winding down, a new order came through. The address was farther out than most deliveries, tucked away in the countryside. The place was 20 minutes from the shop, surrounded by dense woods. I'd never been out that way, and I wasn't thrilled about driving so far this late, but I packed the groceries and headed out. The deeper I got into the woods, the darker and quieter it became. The road narrowed, and my GPS struggled to stay on track. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted the address on a mailbox partially hidden by overgrown bushes. A gravel driveway stretched into the darkness. I turned in and followed the driveway, my car's headlights cutting through the thick trees. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where an old 2-story farmhouse stood. It looked weathered, like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. I parked, grabbed the groceries, and headed for the porch. The house was eerily quiet. No lights in the windows, no sounds from inside, just the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a man's voice calling out from inside. "Just bring it in. I'm in the kitchen." Something about the voice gave me pause. It was cheerful enough, but there was a strained quality to it, like he was forcing himself to sound friendly. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, and the faint smell of mildew hit me. The house was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging in the hallway. "Just in here," the voice called again. I followed the sound into what I assumed was the kitchen. The light flickered as I stepped in. A small, rickety table sat in the middle of the room, completely empty. I set the bags down and waited. "Sir, your groceries are here." No answer. The house was silent, too silent. Then I heard something, faint, almost imperceptible, like the creak of a floorboard in another room. "Sir?" I called again, louder this time. "Back here. Bring it to the den." His voice came from further down the hall. The tone had shifted, less friendly, more impatient. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I found myself stepping out of the kitchen and looking down the hallway. At the end was an open door leading into darkness. "Just bring it in. I'm waiting," he said. His voice was lower now, almost a whisper, but the words carried clearly through the still air. I froze. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver up my spine. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I thought I saw movement, just the slightest shift of shadow near the doorway. That was enough. My fight or flight kicked in, and I turned around, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. As I reached the front door, I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps behind me. "Hey, don't leave," the voice boomed, no longer trying to sound friendly. I didn't look back. I bolted out the door, threw the groceries into the passenger seat, and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind me. My hands were shaking as I sped back to the shop. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not my boss, not my coworkers. What would I say? That I got spooked delivering groceries? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I narrowly avoided something terrible. Whoever was in that house wasn't just being strange. They were waiting for me to step into that dark room. Even now, years later, I don't like thinking about what might have happened if I'd stayed just a moment longer.